To me, Brian Pillman's death is what started the massive snowball of wrestling deaths. We had experienced some tragedies prior to Brian. We had Eddie Gilbert passing away. We had the murder of Bruiser Brody. We had seen a few deaths throughout the years prior to this point, but nothing like what would happen after Brian Pillman's death. Once Pillman died, it seemed like guys were dying left and right. If you fast forward 5 years past 1997 and get to 2003, think of the names we lost in that 5-year span. Just to name a few off the top of my head, I have nothing written down, but I know we lost Mr. Perfect, British Bulldog, Ravishing Rick Rude, Louis Spicoli, Owen Hart, Miss Elizabeth, Stu Hart, Road Warrior Hawk, Crash Holly, all sorts of names. And it just got worse after that. Year after year, we just kept losing dozens of former wrestlers, and it was crazy. And it seemed like it all started with Brian Pillman. But my memories of Brian dying were huge because I was an enormous Brian Pillman fan. I've talked about him so many times in his days in WCW. Flying Brian, this guy trained in Calgary, and he was so ridiculously athletic, being a former football player and just being an all-around great athlete as it was. He transitioned really well into professional wrestling, and when you go back and watch some of the stuff he was doing in the late 80s and early 90s, you say to yourself, God damn, this guy really invented a lot of the high-flying moves that you see today. He was one of the first guys to do this stuff. Before him, we had a lot of high flyers. We had the Rockers and we had Randy Savage and guys like that, but nobody could do the high-flying stuff with the level of athleticism that Brian Pillman had, and he was so fun to watch. And back in those days, the early days of WCW, when they broke away from the NWA and Ted Turner turned him into WCW, you know, Pillman was a big part of that, and I have a lot of memories watching him on Saturday nights and all of the great things he could do, whether he was an enhancement talent or whether they were giving him a push. He was doing a great job. His heel turn turned out to be one of the greatest things they ever did with him. He started out as a heel in WCW when he was teaming with Steve Austin, Stunning Steve Austin as the Hollywood Blondes, and they were probably my favorite tag team in WCW, possibly ever. You know, I know you can lump in the Steiners and the Road Warriors and teams like that, but they also went through the WWE. As far as a WCW exclusive tag team, Brian Pillman and Steve Austin were amazing to watch and incredibly entertaining. And they gelled really well. I know Austin's told stories countless times of how they got together, and he wasn't expecting to be teamed with Brian Pillman, and he kind of rejected it at first. But once they embraced it and really tried their best to become a top team in WCW, they killed it. I mean, they were so entertaining and they were very creative, and it sucks that they were held back. They could have been huge. If they would have gotten over even more and WCW wouldn't have broken them up, they could have came in as a team to the WWE and became a very decorated tag team in WWE history. I mean, we might not have even gotten Stone Cold Steve Austin if that scenario would have played out. So I thought they were a good enough team to succeed even in WWE. Political bullshit during that time in WCW broke them up. And Brian Pillman kind of went off on his own, and then within a few years, he started developing that loose cannon persona. He was a member of the Four Horsemen, and he was just completely crazy. And a lot of people that he worked with, a lot of his fellow wrestlers had no idea if he was working or not, or if he was shooting half the time. I mean, he was really that good, and I think he loved keeping people guessing, and he embraced that loose cannon type persona to where you never knew what the hell he was going to do from week to week. He was acting very eccentric and very erratic and very crazy. And he started creating a lot of buzz for himself. And then he started having issues with WCW. Next thing you know, he turns up in ECW in one of my favorite debuts ever for a wrestler into a promotion, the way he showed up, and all the fans kind of knew he was going to be there and they expected to see him. And then he grabbed the mic and turned heel on everybody. That was an amazing moment in pro wrestling. If you've never seen Brian Pillman's debut in ECW, go check it out. I'm sure it's on the network. I'm sure it's on YouTube. You can find it somewhere, and it's a really fun debut. And it really illustrates and shows you how good of a heel Brian Pillman could be, and how great he was on the mic, and what a great look and feel he had during that time. Brian Pillman was tailor-made for that mid-90s attitude type of era. Unfortunately, before his debut in ECW, he suffered a horrific car accident, and he completely shattered his ankle into a million pieces. Physically, he was never the same again. His days of being an athletic in-ring worker were gone. He was going to have to rely on persona only, and he really shouldn't have ever wrestled again at all. He was in no shape to do it. He was in constant pain. His ankle literally was shattered, and with all of the metal and screws and multiple surgeries he had on his leg, he was never able to return to form. I still found myself being incredibly entertained by Brian Pillman because he was such a good character. And then when he came into the WWE, he was immediately that loose cannon character. They didn't really know what to do with him because he was still on crutches. He was still nursing the injury. So they were using him as an interview guy, and he would do a few crazy things. And I loved the King of the Ring 1996, where he cut the promo talking about rape and pillaging and plundering the entire federation. And then he walked back to the aisle as Stone Cold Steve Austin was making his entrance, and the two of them passed each other in the aisleway and kind of looked at each other. I loved that moment. They never really would team back up together. Ironically, in the last This Day in History video that I did a year ago when I talked about Mind Games in 1996, Brian Pillman and Steve Austin were kind of on the same page for that pay-per-view when Pillman interviewed Owen Hart and Steve Austin, and the three of them were out there shitting on Bret Hart. That was actually a lot of fun, but right after that, they ran the angle where Austin attacked Brian Pillman, injuring his leg and writing him off of TV so he could go have yet another ankle surgery. And then he came back like a year later, joined up with the Hart Foundation, and when he came back, I loved his role in the Hart Foundation. He looked good there. He's always that loose cannon in the group. He did the same thing with the Four Horsemen. With the Hart Foundation, he was kind of that wild card. For a while, they really weren't even including him into the Hart Foundation. He was just their friend. He didn't have the Hart Foundation jacket like all the other guys did. Jim Neidhart was in and out, but he was not as cohesive and close, I don't think, as the Bulldog Owen and Bret were. But for him to be a part of that group, I loved it because it allowed him to shine on the mic. And with the Hart Foundation being a faction, you can kind of put Brian Pillman in matches now. They did the big 10-man tag, which is one of the biggest pay-per-view matches and most fun pay-per-views in WWE history at Calgary Stampede back in the summer of this same year. And Brian Pillman was involved in that, and he had a couple of singles matches, but really that ankle injury completely tied him down, and he wasn't able to do much. His final feud, of course, was with Goldust when they were battling over Marlena. Brian Pillman had to wear a dress after he lost at SummerSlam, and then I believe he won the next match at the next pay-per-view, which gave him custody of Marlena, if you can believe that, and she had to join him on the road for 30 days, and he turned her all gothic and dressed her up in like slutty dominatrix gear and all of that. It was pretty funny stuff. And right in the middle of that angle is when everything went down with Brian Pillman right before the Bad Blood pay-per-view. I remember watching that night. I still have the original broadcast on VHS tape, complete with the free-for-all on the preview channel and the whole deal. And I remember my buddy came over, the same guy that would watch literally every pay-per-view with me during this time. He showed up right before the show came on. We turned on the preview guide or wherever it was and watched the free-for-all. And that's when we saw Vince McMahon make the announcement that Brian Pillman had passed away. And we were shocked. I couldn't believe it. I believe he passed away in Minneapolis or St. Paul, maybe. I forgot where he was. I think it was Bloomington, actually. I want to say Bloomington, but I know he had worked a house show loop around the St. Paul and Minneapolis area and came through there and passed away in the hotel room in Bloomington. And I think he had a heart attack or whatever it was. And it was shocking. And it was just very odd during this time how the WWE handled this, because they would get better at this over the years. I mean, they endured so many deaths that they handled many of them in the future a lot better. But this first one, they kind of botched. And Vince McMahon, I remember even on commentary, the next night on Raw even was one of the craziest nights and the saltiest nights on commentary I can remember the WWE being. I think Vince McMahon was upset about the death of Brian Pillman. I think that he automatically assumed it was a drug overdose. And we know that Brian Pillman definitely had some drug issues. And Vince McMahon was being very, almost aggressive. I remember when he was talking about Brian Pillman, he brought up drugs, and he goes, whether it's, prescription or recreational, it's not acceptable or whatever he said something to that effect, where I was like, wow, Vince seems really upset over this Brian Pillman death. He almost seems pissed off more than sad. And the next night on Raw, they also had the very uncomfortable and odd and strange interview with Brian Pillman's widow, Melanie Pillman, one day after he dies. They have her live via satellite doing an interview on Raw. And it's just dark. I don't even know how to describe it. I know something like this is probably not on the network. Well, it might be if they have all the Raws up there. I'm not sure. Otherwise, check YouTube. And for those of you who haven't seen it, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's just very strange. Why would they even call her and bring her on the show? And I remember Vince even asking her if she knew anything or knew any signs that would, tell her that Brian Pillman was in some trouble. He was just asking her very awkward, uncomfortable questions. And they had a weird marriage too. And just the way the whole interview went down, it was an extremely poor taste, I think, of the WWE to bring her on that close after Brian Pillman died in that state that she's in. And she's just kind of sitting there funny on a couch with her head in her hand. And she just, the interview goes nowhere. It's almost just like they did this shit for ratings or whatever it was. It's just really bizarre, and it was uncomfortable, and I didn't like it. That's also the same night. I know we're going into the next day here on October 6th, but that's the first time I ever heard Vince McMahon on TV acknowledge WCW. That's the night that Shawn Michaels and Triple H showed the curtain call on the Titantron, another This Day in History 20-year anniversary that I did about a year and a half ago. Check the playlist if you want to hear that, which was insane. A year and a half after that, they're showing it on the fucking Titantron. So that was just an odd night of television. Vince McMahon seemed like he was a different person. I don't remember him being on TV or being the Raw announcer after that. He might have been there one more week, and then he was off, never to be seen again. So it's one of Vince McMahon's last Raw broadcasts, and it was his last pay-per-view broadcast at Bad Blood. So as you can tell here, there's just a lot going on during this time. And thinking about what it must have been like to be in the locker room when the news broke of Brian Pillman's death, I think Sunny was interviewing somebody on the free-for-all, and you could tell she had been crying. He had a lot of friends backstage. I know guys like Jim Cornette and Jim Ross and other people that worked with him in WCW. Steve Austin is another guy. His Hart Foundation brothers, of course, people that he's known for years, training with the Hart family ever since he started. So he had a lot of friends and a lot of brothers in that locker room, and it was probably pretty hard for those guys to go out there and work a pay-per-view right after hearing the news of him dying, but it turned out to be one of the most memorable pay-per-views in WWE history. So I just want to give a heartfelt rest in peace to Brian Pillman. I cannot believe that he's been dead for 20 years now. That blows my mind. His death kind of still seems fresh to me because I was a 20-year-old man during that time when that was going on. And I have mostly fond memories aside from the deaths of that time period. And 1997 itself was one of my favorite years in WWE because they started catching up a little bit to WCW. They had a great summer in that run with the Hart Foundation against USA, and Stone Cold Steve Austin was getting on the map. There was so much going on that was positive. The great Bret Hart Stone Cold match at WrestleMania earlier that year. There was a lot going on, and WWE seemed to be the most interesting it had been in quite a while. And then to be hit with a blow like that, a devastating death, one of your top personalities on your roster passes away unexpectedly. WWE could definitely have handled it better, to say the very least. But Brian Pillman was one of my favorites of all time, whether it was in the ring or on the microphone or his look or his persona or his attitude or whatever it was. I literally feel like I loved everything about the guy.